Started with rumors, as it always does. A senator's nephew had gone missing after attending a private celebration in the hills near the Aventine. A servant girl was found trembling in an alley, bloodied but unable to speak. Wine merchants complained of barrels being requisitioned at odd hours. Women, dozens of them, were said to be gathering in secret, chanting in foreign tongues, dancing in the dark. And then, the strange detail that brought it all to the surface. Someone heard screams underground, not just once, night after night, followed by silence. The Roman authorities didn't move quickly. They rarely did when the rumors touched religion. After all, Bacchus, or Dionysus, as the Greeks called him, was an old god, imported, yes, but tolerated. His rites were messy, certainly, but Rome was full of foreign gods, foreign temples, and rituals that made the patricians uncomfortable. It was part of being a tolerant empire, but this was different. When they finally sent a patrol, not a full garrison, just a handful of armed men and a junior magistrate, no one expected them to find anything more than drunken orgy leftovers. Maybe a few drugged initiates, maybe a priest to fine or exile. They did not expect a door hidden in stone. Behind the sanctuary wall was a seam barely visible, smoothed over with dust and plaster, but it opened, downward. Into the rock, a narrow stairwell, slick with moisture, twisted out of view. The guards hesitated, then descended. What hit them first wasn't the heat, it was the smell: copper, decay, mold. The torches hissed in the damp air, casting flickering shadows across the curved tunnel walls. As they stepped deeper, the chanting returned, not from voices still singing, but from their memory, repeating, echoing, and then they reached it, a chamber. Crude, dug out of bedrock, lined with broken amphorae, burned altars' bones, not arranged, not buried, scattered, stained with dried blood, black against stone, and in the far corner where the earth sloped downward, a pile, not offerings. Not statues, bodies, twisted, bound, many naked, some dressed in fragments of ceremonial garb. One had a rope still around his neck. Another, a woman, had a shattered face as if beaten in panic. One corpse had no hands. Another had no eyes. A child no more than 12 lay curled inward, as if trying to fold into herself before it happened. There were signs of fire, signs of ritual, signs of panic, and no signs of burial. When they turned back to report, they carried no names, just numbers, 93, that was the count. At first, the Senate refused to believe it, then they refused to admit it. Because if it were true, if these deaths had happened under their watch, in temples dedicated to a god they had legally recognized, then it wasn't just a cult that had killed. It was Rome that had allowed it. And so the investigation began, slowly, quietly, not with fanfare but with fear. Not fear of what had happened, fear of what would happen if the people found out, because Bacchus was not just a god of wine, he was a god of frenzy. And under frenzy, people do things the Republic cannot contain. They found the bodies, but the killing, that was just the beginning. To the untrained eye, Bacchus looked harmless. He was the god of wine, after all, of laughter, music, and the sweetness of forgetting. In mosaics, he appears with ivy in his hair, a smile on his lips, and a goblet always half full. He is surrounded by women, dancers, satyrs. His festivals, the Bacchanalia, were celebrations of life, fertility, abundance, a release from the weight of the Roman order. But behind that smile, Bacchus was dangerous, because Bacchus wasn't just wine, he was loss of control. And in Rome, control was everything. To the Greeks, he had been Dionysus, and even then they feared him. His arrival in the Pantheon had always been uneasy. Wherever Dionysus went, chaos followed. The madness of the Maenads, the tearing of flesh, the ritual frenzy that blurred the line between worship and violence. He was a god of transformation, not comfort, not stability. He did not ask for quiet reverence, he demanded surrender. When Rome adopted Bacchus into its vast, expanding pantheon, they thought they could civilize him, regulate his worship, assign his rites to safe places and safe hours. But Bacchus does not belong in temples. His true rituals are held in forests, in caves, in sweat and screaming. To worship Bacchus was to become someone else or no one at all, and it was not just the nature of his rites that threatened Rome, it was who attended them, women. Slaves, outsiders, those with no voice in the Republic found one in the Bacchanalia, their status dissolved. A patrician woman could strip away her rank and scream beside a prostitute. A slave could speak prophecy. A widow could lead a rite. In a society built on rigid hierarchy, Bacchus flattened the structure. And worse still, he inspired loyalty. Those who gave themselves to Bacchus didn't just worship, they surrendered. The cult demanded secrecy, obedience, and protection of its members at all costs. If someone betrayed the ritual, they were punished. If someone resisted joining, they were seduced or broken. So when Rome began to hear whispers of midnight gatherings, of orgiastic rites, of women fleeing home and never returning, they were not hearing about a god. They were hearing about a counter-society. a world within the Republic that played by different rules. Bacchus was not feared because he drank wine, he was feared because he broke people open, and made them unpredictable. And in a world ruled by predictability, that was the greatest crime of all. The Bacchanalia did not begin in blood. In their earliest form, they were celebrations, nocturnal festivals held in wooded groves and sacred clearings outside the city walls. A place where worshippers, especially women, could shed their daily identities and dissolve into something older, freer, untamed. The god Bacchus did not ask for obedience. He offered intoxication, frenzy, and the chance to forget who you were. The rituals were secret, always at night, always under torches or moonlight. Drums pounded low and steady. Wine flowed without limit. And at the height of it all came the orgia, the moment where individual thought disappeared into movement, into voice, into the body becoming something more than itself. At first, the Roman elite tolerated it, even indulged in it. Some senators sent their wives to participate. Others attended in masks, claiming it was curiosity. For a time, it became fashionable, exotic, erotic, a flirtation with danger. The Bacchanalia offered what Roman society denied: release, anonymity, and belonging. But then something shifted. The rites grew more frequent, more private, no longer seasonal. They became monthly, then weekly, then daily. The gatherings moved from sacred woods to basements, courtyards, and hidden chambers in the Aventine. The number of initiates exploded from hundreds to thousands. Many of them were women, many were slaves. And increasingly, those inside the cult refused to leave it. A new rule emerged: what happens in the rite stays in the rite. Violation of secrecy meant punishment. Exposure meant death. The Bacchanalia was no longer a religious expression. It became a network. Initiation involved humiliation, blood, and oaths. Participants were made to confess secrets, political, sexual, personal, which were then used to bind them in silence. Some were forced to commit acts they could never speak of. Others claimed they saw visions. A few said they spoke with Bacchus himself, not in words, but in seizures, screams, and sudden laughter. And those who refused, they disappeared. No one knows how many. Some were said to have drowned in rivers, their mouths stuffed with olive leaves to mimic ritual purity. Others simply vanished after attending one gathering, never returning home. And when families went to ask questions, they were told, "He's been chosen, let him go." There were whispers of sexual coercion, not as pleasure, but as control. Young initiates taken by older members in ritual submission. Boys offered to high priestesses as sacrifices of flesh, not blood. Women forced to drink until they collapsed, then woken by cold water and a voice telling them they had been reborn. And the worst part, some wanted to return. Because once you had danced in the dark, screamed among the trees, felt your identity burn off like fog, the Roman Forum felt suffocating. The toga, the law, the family, the Senate, all of it felt like a cage. Bacchus didn't enslave them, he seduced them. And once seduced, they would do anything to stay, even kill. Her name barely made it into the official records. Hispala Ficenia, a freedwoman, former prostitute, no family, no protection. The kind of woman Rome tolerated in silence until she knew something the Republic could no longer ignore. She never wanted to speak, but the boy made her. Publius Ebutius was young, too young to understand what his stepmother was asking of him. She had encouraged him to join the rites of Bacchus. She said it would be good for him, that it would make him a man, that it would connect him to Rome's real power, the kind not listed in public records or chiseled into marble. But he was unsure. He turned to the only person who had ever told him the truth, Hispala. She had once been his lover, not out of love, out of convenience, closeness, something undefined and warm in the shadowed rooms of patrician homes. She listened, then with a voice that cracked from memory more than fear, she told him what she had seen. She had been initiated years before. She was younger then, naive enough to believe Bacchus meant joy, freedom, release. And at first it felt like that. The music, the wine, the touch of strangers in the dark, but the faces changed. The laughter got harder, the nights got longer, and then came the first death. She spoke of a man barely older than Ebutius, drugged until he couldn't speak, then strangled when he refused to swear himself to the cult. His body was never buried. She remembered the way the priestesses laughed afterward. Said Bacchus had taken him in. Another night she saw a woman tied to a stone altar, not offered, punished. She had tried to leave the rites. She had told her sister what happened there, that was her crime. They beat her until her mouth stopped bleeding. Then they told everyone else to keep dancing, and they did. Hispala said that the Bacchanalia wasn't a religion anymore. It was a machine, it devoured secrets. It recorded every weakness and used them. Initiates were made to confess their worst sins, sometimes real, sometimes invented. What mattered was that they believed someone now owned them. That if they ever disobeyed, those secrets would be brought to light, or worse, used against their families. She said she saw children there, not not often, but enough. One girl, no more than 13, was made to drink until she collapsed. When she woke, her clothes were gone. A priest whispered to her, "Now Bacchus knows you." No one helped her, no one ever did. Eubudia sat in silence when she finished. He didn't cry, he didn't speak, he stood and went to the authorities. When Hispala was brought in for questioning, she didn't hesitate. She repeated everything. In full, in public, under oath, her voice shook, but it didn't break. She told the names of highborn women who had attended. She told them which alley led to the hidden door. She told them which chants meant submission, and which ones meant prepare the body. She told them where the bodies were buried or burned. And she told them what Rome had chosen not to see. When she finished, the room was silent, not out of respect, out of fear, because now the truth had weight, it had form, it had testimony, but it also had a target. Hispala was now marked not by law, but by memory. She had survived the rites, now she had done something even more dangerous. She had spoken of them, and for that, she would never be safe again. The investigation began quietly. Rome didn't want chaos, it wanted containment. After Hispala Ficinia's testimony and Publius Ebutius' report, the Senate was forced to act not because of religious outrage, but because now the rot had a name. And more dangerously, it had a map. Underneath villas, in empty cellars, in the soil behind temples, the search began. They started with the known locations, the sanctuary Hispala mentioned, the garden hall in the Aventine, the storage room beneath a public bathhouse. In each place they found what no one had ever admitted aloud, not rituals, not relics, but remains. First sight yielded bones, dozens, skulls split, rib cages crushed, hands bound with linen long decayed into dust. Some were intact, most weren't. The second sight, deeper underground, revealed something worse. Pits, not graves, pits, no shrouds, no markers, just bodies packed and stacked. Some still had ceremonial jewelry on, others had been stripped. One man was found with his own oath tablet shoved down his throat, as if to ensure his silence, even in death. At the third site they found ash, not wood ash, bone ash. Enough to suggest multiple cremations, unrecorded, unauthorized, and entirely hidden from Rome's civic eye. By the end of the month, the tally was impossible to ignore. 93 dead, confirmed. Human remains cataloged by magistrates, physicians, and military scribes. No battlefield, no rebellion, no plague, just 93 Roman citizens, banished inside a system that called itself sacred. The Senate tried to control the narrative. They said it was a local corruption of an otherwise permitted right. They said it was mystical excess. They said it had been dealt with, but some in the Senate knew better. The cult wasn't just a religious deviation. It was a cover, a network of influence and secrecy that extended through families, clients, and even politicians. Some names found in the records were never read aloud. They were folded, sealed, and stored. Rome protected its own. What made the Bacchanalia so dangerous was not the wine or the gods, it was the structure. The way it turned faith into leverage, ritual into obedience, shame into silence. And silence into murder. Most of the dead were never identified. Their names were not carved, their families never informed. Their lives reduced to numbers in an archive that no one ever opened again. 93. That's the count Rome allowed to surface. How many more were buried deeper? How many were burned before the questions ever began? No one asked, because in the end, the Republic was never afraid of blood. It was afraid of disorder. When the reports came in, real names, real bodies, real locations, the Senate didn't debate the morality of murder. They debated optics. The Bacchanalia scandal had reached the tipping point. There were now confirmed dead. Entire rooms filled with bone fragments, secret meetings in basements beneath temples, and worst of all, testimonies implicating not just commoners but noble families, wives of senators, sons of magistrates. Slaves of consuls whispering Latin prayers twisted into madness. Rome could not ignore it any longer, but it didn't react the way you'd expect. There was no great speech about the sanctity of life. No outrage over the desecration of faith. No mourning for the 93 dead. Instead, they met in private chambers, the Curia Hostilia, where decisions were made away from public eyes. The walls were thick, the guards were loyal. The scrolls burned afterward, because what they were really debating wasn't how to stop a cult, it was how to stop a chain reaction. What terrified them wasn't Bacchus, it was what Bacchus represented, loss of control. The rites had grown large, decentralized, hard to monitor. They weren't contained in one temple. They moved from noble gardens to seedy taverns, from wine cellars to courtyards at midnight. What began as worship had become a movement. And the worst part, it was growing among the wrong people. Women, slaves, foreigners, even soldiers stationed too far from home, drunk and lonely, looking for purpose. People with no stake in Rome's rigid order. People ready to believe in something that said, you don't need the Senate, you don't need your family, you only need Bacchus. and so the Senate voted, not to investigate further but to crush it, fast, loud, publicly. They declared the bacchanalia illegal except under strict license. Rites could only be held with state approval, with no more than 5 people at a time, no more secrecy, no more masks, no more music after dark. And then came the arrests. The real purge happened in silence. Over 6,000 people were detained, some confessed, others were tortured until they did. Some were executed outright, thrown into the Tiber, necks broken and bags tied shut. Their families were warned, grieve, and you joined them. The lucky ones were exiled. The unlucky were made examples of. One woman, a former priestess named Pacula Ania, was dragged through the forum, stripped and flayed until her skin came off in pieces. Her crime, hosting the rites in her home and initiating others into false ecstasy. Her blood painted the stones, and the Senate called it purification. The message was clear. This wasn't about faith, it was about fear. The kind of fear that spreads among rulers when the ruled begin to gather without permission. The kind of fear that turns rituals into rebellion and gods into threats. But behind the speeches, behind the stone-faced executions, one truth lingered in every corridor of power. Rome had known for years and done nothing, because until now the bacchanalia had been useful, a pressure valve, a place to dump unrest and call it religion, until it grew too large, too loud, too uncontrollable. Now they called it an infection, but they were the ones who let it spread. And as the executions piled up, as the last of the bodies were buried in unnamed pits, the Senate returned to silence. A silence thicker than any prayer, and more terrifying than the cult they had just destroyed. Rome was never afraid of blood. It was built on blood. From its mythic origins, twin brothers raised by a wolf, one murdered to found the city, to its daily gladiatorial games, decapitations, crucifixions, and state executions, death was routine. It was public, celebrated, controlled. That was the key, control. Rome could stomach violence. It could even sell it to the masses as entertainment, justice, or divine punishment. What it couldn't tolerate, what it feared more than any enemy at its gates, was disorder without permission. The bacchanalia wasn't dangerous because it killed people. Rome killed people every day. It was dangerous because it operated outside the system. Worshippers didn't need a magistrate's approval. They didn't wear togas in proper folds. They didn't bow to the state gods. They didn't even ask permission to feel. In a society where emotion was weakness and obedience was strength, the Bacchic cult offered something radical: release. A place to weep, to dance, to scream, to tear your status off like old skin and become ungovernable. And that, not the blood, was what Rome couldn't accept, because Rome was not a democracy, not truly. It was a carefully managed hierarchy. Every man had a rank, every woman a role, every slave a chain, every citizen a duty. Even the gods had titles: Capitoline, approved, ranked, budgeted. Bacchus had no interest in those titles. He appeared to women in dreams. He whispered to slaves in their sleep. He made promises without Senate approval. He offered power where the Republic offered silence, and worse, people followed him, not with banners, with bodies, with memory, with obedience not bought but given. That terrified the Senate. Because no amount of marble, law, or steel can rule the inside of a person. And Bacchus had taken residence inside thousands, so they declared war, not on the god, but on what he represented. They called him foreign. They called the rites decadent. They said the participants were perverting Roman virtue. But what they were really doing was reestablishing authority, reclaiming the emotional monopoly the Republic believed it was entitled to. Because Rome didn't just want to rule land, it wanted to rule thought. And Bacchus, wild, shapeless, laughing Bacchus, refused to be ruled. Rome declared the bacchanalia destroyed. The temples were torn down, the scrolls burned. The priests either executed or disappeared. The Senate made its statements. The Republic had been defended, the moral order restored. Citizens nodded, soldiers marched, and life resumed, at least on the surface. But belief doesn't obey decrees, it shifts. The rites didn't end, they relocated, moved from the outskirts of the city to within the estates of the wealthy. Woods to the gardens, from cellars to salons, the wine never stopped flowing. It just came in better cups, the chants quieted, but the structure remained. Initiation still required secrecy, still involved loss, still demanded obedience. What had once been called bacchanalia now had other names, more refined, more acceptable. The symposium, the evening circle, the Dionysian club, no longer a religious cult, they became gatherings of cultured men and their inspired guests. But inside, the rituals were familiar. Dim lighting, veiled servants, unspoken rules, and rules that couldn't be broken. The women returned too, not as priestesses, as entertainment. Their roles hadn't changed, only their titles, and the consequences for speaking out. Still the same, among the elite, silence was not enforced by rope or blood. It was enforced by status, by inheritance, by the quiet threat of scandal. And so the new bacchanalia continued, polished, masked, but no less bound by submission and secrecy. Some of the old initiates saw it. Survivors of the purges, now older, quieter, stood at the edges of garden parties and watched the same patterns unfold, just without the screaming. They recognized the pacing of the wine. The order in which guests were invited into inner rooms, the way laughter covered something darker. They said nothing, because they knew empires don't truly destroy dangerous ideas. They absorb them, they tame them. They give them new names and serve them to guests in silver cups. Rome didn't kill Bacchus, it simply made him acceptable, controllable, fashionable. That's how the cult survived, not by resisting the Republic, but by becoming part of it. And no one would ever call it a cult again. It's easy to point at the bacchanalia and call it a cult. The secrecy, the rituals, the blood, the submission. But what if the only thing that made it terrifying was that it didn't wear the right robes? Rome was full of gods, Jupiter, Mars, Venus, Janus. Each had temples, priests, rituals, sacrifices. Many demanded offerings of animals, some required abstinence, others blood. The difference was that those gods were state-approved. Their violence was clean, accounted for, justified. Bacchus wasn't. He operated outside the system, which meant that when his rituals turned violent, when women were broken, when bodies disappeared, there was no one to blame. Because no one was watching, and that more than anything is what made it dangerous, not the acts but the absence of accountability. In Rome, as in every empire, violence was not condemned, it was measured. As long as the violence reinforced structure, punished the right criminals, crucified the right rebels, sacrificed to the right gods, it was sacred. But once violence became unpredictable or unsanctioned or worse, chosen freely by people outside the state's reach, then it became heresy. What the bacchanalia exposed painfully was that religion has always been a double-edged sword. It can offer healing, belonging, transcendence, and it can be used to bind, to silence, to hurt, sometimes all at once. And worse when it becomes normalized, when it's called tradition or culture or heritage. No one stops to ask whether what's happening in the name of faith is, in fact, faith at all. The bacchanalia stopped being about Bacchus a long time before the Senate banned it. It had become a system of obedience, of fear, of exploitation wrapped in the language of liberation. It didn't promise salvation. It promised transformation at any cost, even your body, even your voice, even your life, and Rome, for years, looked away. Because when a structure delivers loyalty and loyalty delivers power, no one questions the bruises. Until someone screams, until someone dies, until someone speaks and makes others remember what they've accepted in silence. That's when cults fall, not because they're evil, but because someone finally calls them by their name. But the truly dangerous ones, the ones built into stone and law and memory, they never get called anything at all, because once a cult is old enough, rich enough, institutional enough, we call it culture. The number is real. 93 dead, not in war, not in rebellion, but in silence, in shadows. Inside rituals so thick with incense and secrecy that by the time anyone dared speak, the bodies were already decomposing beneath Roman soil. And still, that wasn't the worst of it, because Rome didn't lose control of a cult. It let it happen, let it grow, let it fester until it became too visible to ignore. The scariest part is not that people died. It's that they died inside a system designed to make that acceptable. The bacchanalia was never just a fringe cult. It had sponsors, it had patrons, it had noble women opening their villas, priests with clients in high places, and soldiers too loyal to question what happened behind closed doors. It had structure, and structure protects. People were tortured and no one called it punishment. They were raped and it was called devotion. They were killed and it was called purification. They were disappeared and no one even asked where they went, because once violence is sanctified, once it's woven into ceremony, once it's conducted with enough candles and prayers, people stop seeing it. That's the most terrifying truth. Not that a cult did this, but that it did it so well, so systematically, so efficiently, that even the greatest empire in the world didn't see the deaths as crimes, only complications. And when Rome finally acted, it wasn't out of justice, it was out of fear. Fear that they were no longer in charge of the violence, because Rome was never afraid of people dying. Rome was afraid of people dying without permission. So yes, they killed 93 people, and maybe more, and yes, it was evil, but the scariest part, it was organized, it was tolerated, and for a very long time, it was called religion.